The Bible says that those cities would be turned to ash, be destroyed, the whole land would be brimstone, right? Here's brimstone here. And then it said you'd have salt, and this is a chunk of rock salt here. You got rock salt, and then they said there would be evidence of burning. This rock was apparently near the perimeter, were collected from the Jordanian side, refired tiles, like ceramic tiles.
All right. Hey, Jerry, how are you?
I'm good. I'm
Good to see
absolutely good.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, nice to see you.
All right, everyone. As you can see, my guest today is going to be Jerry Bowen. This time, we're going to talk about Sodom and Gomorrah. We're going to go over that discovery of Ron's, and we're just going to dive right into it. So, Mr. Jerry, you have the floor, sir.
Okay. Well, let me start off by saying that appreciate you having me on again. And the subjects that we deal with are, of course, pretty interesting, pretty exciting, pretty necessary for our world to see these days. I will say, though, that it is interesting that within archaeology in general, whether it's secular archaeology or biblical archaeology, it tells a story. Archaeology research is designed to tell a story. And the message in the story that the sites that we deal with convey is not only very exciting and very biblically oriented, but they're also for folks today. Even though these things occurred thousands of years ago, the message is absolutely right on, spot on, as they say, for our generation, for our time. So, with that said, it is true that Ron traveled up and down Route 90, which is the highway that runs up and down along the Dead Sea coast, numerous times before looking over, seeing some whitish-looking kind of formations, and he all of a sudden realized or was inspired to pull over and kind of take an initial look.
What was it about that location when he first saw it that stood out to him? What was it that made him think, "Hey, I need to go up to this one"?
Well, as I said, he had been back and forth through there numerous times on his way to the Red Sea work that he was doing over there at Aqaba. And, again, when, Ron was the kind of guy that he was already dealing with Noah's Ark research there, and he was dealing with research of the Red Sea, Nuweiba. And, of course, the access to that was up and down that highway. But after going up and down there numerous times, he was inspired to take a look. I'm sure he noticed those things. You can't help but notice them. They stand out like a sore thumb. But
how far away from the road would you say it is?
Maybe a couple of blocks.
Oh, okay. All right.
A couple of blocks off the highway. And of course, what he was really looking at, the remains of Gomorrah are the ones that are probably the best preserved, because they're kind of nestled up against the mountains there a bit, and where Masada is. If your listeners have an idea where Masada is, you have to kind of drive right through. The access road up to Masada goes right through Gomorrah. And so I'm sure Ron was noticing Masada, which is kind of a singular, isolated mountain. The Bible actually refers to it when it talks about, Lot and his daughters going to the mountain, not mountains, but the mountain. They're probably referencing Masada there because it's a standalone. So he probably was looking over at Masada and then just happened to notice the different colors. And of course, he had a construction background. And so he's noticing also the the formations and how they might resemble buildings, perhaps. And so he got curious enough one day as he was going through there to stop momentarily, take a look around, and he started finding some things, and he picked up some samples of things, and then he went on his way. When he got back home, he dropped those samples off to Galbraith Labs, one of the labs that he used to use there in Tennessee, and basically asked them to do a couple of different tests on them, etc. And I'm sure that took probably a couple of weeks to work out. And so that was in the mix while he was working on Noah's Ark and the Red Sea site, etc. So, so what's interesting is that he eventually went back, and as a result of the testing that was done on the samples he collected, he recognized that the the soil that he took was not was not dirt, but it ended up being ash. Okay, here's a bag of that right here on the screen.
Is that actually from Sodom?
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah. Well, that's probably from Gomorrah.
Oh, okay.
So Sodom is not as easy to access and not as well preserved as Gomorrah is. But and I would say Gomorrah was either rivaled Sodom in size or maybe even was bigger, because I think it extended across the Jordan, the valley there, what's now the Dead Sea, into what now is Jordan. We've been over there looking around as well as on the Israeli side. So anyway, he started to take some things over there, and he recognized that, well, this is ash. And then he had some other samples. Now this is brimstone here. This story actually occurred 3,900 years ago, about 600 years after the flood event. And so, and Ron wasn't, of course, the first person to recognize these particular areas. There are historical records that go back a lot further. Most people would recognize Flavius Josephus as a first century historian, Jewish historian. And in his writings, he indicated that that he had been to the cities that had been destroyed, and he even found, he even saw the different things that were there that recognized them as the authentic biblical sites.
Now the Bible tells us that it rained fire and brimstone upon the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah. Now what you see in front of you here is the results of large and small, well, varying sized chunks of sulfur, burning sulfur, that have hit. And what we find here is that God rained this burning sulfur down upon this city, and rain is a perfect description of it. It landed just in the pattern that rain would fall, and the stuff, of course, the accumulative heat of all of this upon the city set the entire thing ablaze. The flashpoint of every material there, metal, stone, of course the people, and everything burned, and this sulfur continued to burn, and it vitrified the material around it after it had burned it all up, sealed itself off from the oxygen, and then of course smothered itself out. And in each of these little crystalline capsules here is a varying size chunk of sulfur, and there are millions of these in these ashes that we have here. Now some of them we have cracked open so you can see the sulfur inside, and others we have left intact, but there are millions of these here. So this shows that God indeed rained fire and brimstone upon these cities. And if you'll look in your dictionary, under brimstone, you'll find that it is sulfur.
The atmospheric conditions at this particular height are unusual. They're one of a kind in the world. So we're probably 1,000 feet below sea level, which means that the air density at this level is much more condensed, for lack of a better word. That means that things are going to burn a lot hotter. It's sort of like being inside an automobile combustion engine. By increasing the compression of the fuel, you'll be able to ignite it more efficiently. So let me take this one. Now, I normally don't carry a lighter with me, but you're going to see that when it starts to ignite, it turns yellow and starts to burn. It continues to burn. It turns into this red molten, almost like lava. It starts to flow. So as you watch this melt, anything in its proximity is going to be totally annihilated. Now it's turning into a liquid and starting to flow. This is amazing to see. I've never seen anything like this before. Now there's a smoke that's coming out of it that's extremely noxious, possibly even deadly. So if anyone had doubts as to whether fire and brimstone have the capacity to do this kind of destruction, I think this becomes rather obvious.
So when you go into the Bible, of course, the Bible tells the story in Genesis 18 and 19, where, and of course, I think many people are familiar with the story in Genesis there, where Lot ends up going in the direction, Lot and Abram, their flocks and herds grow so big that in I think it's Genesis 13, they end up splitting apart. They split apart. Lot, and basically Abraham says, if you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left, etc. And to keep peace in the family. And Lot goes toward Sodom. He goes toward the cities of the plain. And as Ron began to get more and more interested as a result of this testing, he decides that he's going to go and spend some time there and do some biblical research and whatnot. One of the things that he does is, or one of the scriptures, obviously, that's relatively important, Deuteronomy chapter 29. Once he began to study it out, verse 23 says here that the whole land thereof is brimstone and salt and burning. It is not sown nor beareth, nor any grass groweth therein, like the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. So as Ron's studying it out, he recognizes, people always hear, Sodom and Gomorrah, not realizing that there were additional cities as well that extended along the western side of the Dead Sea, what we would call the Israeli side of the Dead Sea. And like I said, I think even Gomorrah extended across what would have been originally the Jordan River flowing down through that vale, the Vale of Siddim, the valley before it became the Dead Sea, extended across there. We find the same thing across there. We find similar formations. We find brimstone, salt, evidence of burning, etc., even on the Jordanian side. So Ron began to realize, well, there's more than just Sodom and Gomorrah here, and he started to do some research in the entire area. And eventually found 5 locations, because what's not mentioned in this particular verse is Bela or Zoar, which is the small city that Lot and his daughters were instructed to go to, or actually he wanted to go to that particular city. I think the angels were trying to get him to go to the mountain to Masada initially, but he wanted to go to that little small city, which was Zoar, which is not terribly far from Sodom. Now, typical biblical archaeology today, I think, is aware of these locations, or at least some of them anyway. But they have invested, just like with Mount Ararat, they've invested a lot of time and reputation into a cluster of cities around the southern end of the Dead Sea. Bodin Dra is one, Palmyra is another. They've got there's a whole list. Of course, they do claim that Zoar is down there, which it is. Canazar is down there as well. And so when you go to these cities, what's interesting, Brandon, is when you go to these locations, there's a world of difference between what they're calling the traditional cities and the actual ashen remains of the cities that Ron was led to. When you go to like Bodin Dra and whatnot, you'll find, I mean, these are cities that they say were destroyed by fire, and they may have a burned lair, right? But they're doing some shady stuff, to be honest with you, because of course you still see the rocks and you see some pottery there, you see some human remains, bones and things of that still there. They find, in other words, this is stuff that you would find from an archaeological dig. As you dug down certain layers, you would find remnants of these particular cities. In Sodom and Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and Zoar, you have total annihilation. The Bible says they were turned to ash, right? The Bible actually provides 6 criteria. And let me just also mention one of the things that they're doing. One of the things that they're doing to try to add some credibility to these other places is they're going to places like Gomorrah, and they're retrieving handfuls of brimstone. And they're going back to these cities and they're saying, yeah, see, there's burn rings here, and there looks like there may be some ash here. And then they're saying, and this is the brimstone, we believe, from the area. So they're kind of misleading people a little bit, trying to add some credibility. The brimstone.
How big of an area was that? Like Sodom and Gomorrah, the towns that were actually destroyed. Within the circumference of all that, how large of an area is that about?
Yeah, these are all Canaanite cities, and one of the earmarks of a Canaanite city is it had kind of a squarish type of layout, and also they would have double Canaanite walls surrounding them. These are some of the telltale signs of Canaanite cities. And of course, you see this very clearly with Zoar. When you see a panoramic shot of that or an aerial shot of that, you can see it's kind of a square shape. Just basically a square shape of ash is what it kind of looks like, with some things that look like possible formations, etc. I would say Sodom and Gomorrah seemed like they were the largest. And if I'm trying to think, actually Sodom and Gomorrah were fairly decent size. I would say they probably had maybe even 100,000 residents in Gomorrah, particularly if it extended across the Jordan River there into what's now Jordan. So you may have had 100,000 people in Gomorrah. Maybe Sodom may have been rivaled that, may have been 100,000 as well, and then you might have had maybe in Zoar and the other cities maybe 10 to 20,000 in terms of people. So I'm just giving you a population estimate so that you kind of get an idea of how much distance you need to facilitate that many people. I don't know if we ever really took a measurement in kilometers or miles, etc. Like I said, Zoar is pretty small. Sodom and Gomorrah, much greater, a whole lot more extensive, etc. But I'm not really sure of the estimate in the size. Now we live close to Blacksburg, Christiansburg, and Roanoke. Yeah, so I would say, Roanoke would be like a Sodom and Gomorrah.
Oh, okay.
And and Christiansburg would be like a Zoar. Edmonds, a Bowen would be like a Blacksburg, that kind of thing.
So, and I'll put pictures up on the screen for people to see that because not everybody's familiar with Virginia, but that's probably, I'll put it in the terms for people. We're probably looking at an area that's probably, what, 30 miles, 25, 30 miles for if you were to drive from one side to the other, something like that?
Maybe 20.
20? Okay.
Yeah.
So we're probably looking at about 20 miles squared. Something
Yeah,
like
now
that.
with Gomorrah, because it extended across, I think, into Jordan, which would make sense. That would be like a Roanoke Salem, if you're familiar with the area. You've got the Roanoke River that kind of divides Roanoke and Salem.
Mhm.
And so that would be kind of an example, if you will, of Gomorrah. But yeah, probably 20 miles. And even Zoar is only about, I would say, maybe less than 10 miles away from Sodom.
Because when you're looking at this on a map, when this place was actually destroyed, you got to think all this was being destroyed all at one time. So if, we're looking at 20 miles, about 20 miles squared, that is a significant amount of land that's being destroyed. I mean, people from miles away would have seen this, right?
Yeah, and of course, the Bible does mention that Abram was out that morning, and when he looked in the direction of the cities of the plain, he said it was going up like a furnace. He said it looked like a furnace was, it probably resembled something like a nuclear explosion. And just to be clear, you had Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim that were destroyed at one time. Lot and his daughters ended up in Zoar. And when they saw what had happened, and I'm not sure how the rest of the people viewed it, but when they saw what happened to those other cities, they ended up leaving Zoar and going to the mountain, which we believe was Masada. And so then Zoar was destroyed at a later time. And so and of course, you got to remember, when you look at these slides and you look at the topography now and you look at the area, what does the Bible say about that area? Genesis 14, it says that area was like the garden of God. That was like the Garden of Eden. Lot went that way because it was well watered. Okay, and of course you had big herds and so forth, and so you would need a lot of that. But there were a lot of other things going on in Zoar too. But let me just emphasize the 6 criteria that Ron was looking at. The Bible says that those cities would be turned to ash, right? He had collected that and had that analyzed. The Bible says they would be destroyed. The whole land would be brimstone, right? Here's brimstone here, and you can even find it much larger. Here's a much larger piece of brimstone. You find it in various sizes. You also find it in capsules, and I don't know if you can see this very clearly, but there's a small piece of sulfur in the middle of this capsule. It's like a capsule that's been cut in half to show that. Here's a capsule here, right? Now, if you cut this open, you'll find brimstone inside of this. It's just like a peach seed, and you eat the peach and you crack the seed open, and you see it's there. The Bible also says you'd have, so you got ash, you got brimstone, and then it said you'd have salt. And this is a chunk of rock salt here, okay, pulled from the ashen remains, right? You got rock salt, and then they said there would be evidence of burning. And so I can show this. Now this is, you can see how that's darkened on that side. This rock was apparently near the perimeter and was burned. There's the inside of the rock there. You can see the actual color of the rock there. And you can see that it's scorched on this side here. All right. So there's some of your burning. But here's another indication of the burning. These were collected from the Jordanian side. Okay. I don't know if you can hear this or not. Hear that?
Yeah, what is that?
These were refired tiles.
Oh,
Refired tiles, like ceramic tile.
yeah.
Everything in the area, even the ceramics, the stone, everything that was close to the proximity of the cities were turned to ash. Right? And so the Bible also says in that same verse there, Deuteronomy 29:23, it says nothing would grow there. Right? And then in another verse in Jeremiah, you'll read there are other comments in Jeremiah, etc., that talk about nothing would grow there and no one would, the area would not be inhabited as well. Now, when you look in Deuteronomy 29, it's talking there about, I'm just going to pick it up at verse 21. There says, and the Lord shall separate him unto evil out of the tribes of Israel. So in other words, Israel had gone into apostasy, and God is going to separate the wheat from the tares, according to all that the curses of the covenant that are written in the book of the law. And verse 22 says, and that the generation to come of your children that shall rise up after you, and the stranger that shall come from a far land shall say, when they see the plagues of that land and the sicknesses which the Lord had laid upon it, and the whole land thereof is brimstone, salt, and burning, and it's not sown, nor beareth, so no agriculture is being done there, nor any grass groweth therein, like the overthrow of Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, and Zeboim, which the Lord overthrew in his anger and in his wrath. Verse 24 is significant. Even all nations shall say, wherefore hath the Lord done thus unto this land? What meaneth the heat of his great anger? And so when you look at these cities here, and you see this physical evidence, Brandon, and I was there with a friend of mine one time, and we had a metal detector with us. We had been out to Turkey and used it on Noah's Ark to identify metal readings out there. But we took the metal detector and we decided we were going to go ahead and scan for any possible elements in Gomorrah. And we thought maybe the machine was broken because it would either beep or register on a meter if it picked up something. There is absolutely nothing there. Everything was consumed. Every element was consumed. The meter never registered. It never beeped. We had to keep running it across our shoe lancets to make sure it was still working, because it's a totally dead zone, right? A totally dead zone, if you will. Now, what ancient armies would do when they would go conquer a land, if they didn't want any inhabitants to repopulate that area, they would sow salt into the ground. They would actually salt the land so that nothing could grow. And of course, if nothing grows, then it's an area that people aren't going to dwell in. And this is indeed the situation that you have there. But that question there, why has God done this? What's the lesson? I mean, this is a lesson of judgment. The Canaanites had filled up their cup of iniquity. They had ripened themselves for destruction, right? Now, I know a lot of people have been told, and a lot of people say, well, they were just, and the Bible does state that they were evil exceedingly, right? It was a corrupt culture, but why? How did they ripen themselves to get to this place of kind of no return, stepping across the line that God arbitrarily had set that he would not forbear? And then, of course, judgment followed. If you turn to Ezekiel, if you go to Ezekiel 16, that's probably, you can go other places too, but probably Ezekiel 16 is one of the places that spells it kind of right out for our folks. 48 and 49. says there, as I live, saith the Lord, Sodom thy sister hath not done, nor her daughters as thou hast done. Now, what Ezekiel is doing, he's comparing these cities to Jerusalem. Okay? So he says, as I live, saith the Lord, Sodom thy sister hath not done, nor she nor her daughters as thou hast done, thou and thy daughters. Behold, this was the iniquity of thy sister Sodom. This was the law. Iniquity is the word lawlessness. This was where they were violating God's law. This was the result. Thy sister Sodom. And he lists four things here: pride, fullness of bread, abundance of idleness was in her and her daughters. Neither did she strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. Now, we probably don't have time to go through a comprehensive study, and I would invite people to just go through a study on this, and it really spells out the reasons that God destroyed these cities. Okay,
What is it in a nutshell?
Pardon me?
What would you say it is in a nutshell?
Well, when you look at pride, for example, you go through and do a little research on pride. I can just give you some verses here that you can list in the program here. Proverbs 8:13, 11:2, 13:10, and 16:18. And you just look at some of these. Basically, the Bible says, pride goeth before contention. I think that's in Psalms 10. Pride goeth before contention. In other words, any contention, any warfare, any conflicts that have ever developed on this planet, pride is always at the heart. Pride is always at the foundation. Okay. Fullness of bread. As I mentioned before, Lot went in this area because the area was like the Garden of Eden. It was well watered. So, and he had large flocks and herds and so forth. And so there was plenty of food, plenty of water, etc. It was also an area that had slime pits, Bible says. And so you have an industry, an incredible industry there that had developed. This is Genesis 14:10. They had wells of bitumen or tar pits of asphalt. And this was like liquid gold back at that time.
What they use for their ships, right?
I imagine they had all kinds of uses for this, for maybe lamps or fire and different things of that nature. Who knows? They maybe even used it like we use asphalt today for roadways and that kind of thing. I don't know if they would get into something like that or not. But remember, I mean, this is 600 years after the flood event, so there were probably quite a bit of development there. But you have an industry there. You have a thriving economy, if you will. Fullness of bread. In other words, there's no real want, or there are people starving because there's plenty of agriculture, plenty of husbandry, etc. going on, and plus industry. You probably have people making carpets, pottery, all kinds of things going on there. Anyway, the fullness of bread, what happens when a culture pushes God out of the picture, the true God of heaven out of the picture, and starts to focus their attention and time on the things that they're developing, and on a lot of the material things that they might possess, homes, in that generation, maybe horses and carts and things of that nature. The Bible, when we put something before God, we call that idolatry, right? So when you start to idolize the things, and of course God blesses. He blesses us in so many wonderful ways with talents and abilities and opportunities, and even in Deuteronomy it says, God's the one that enables people to gain wealth and this kind of thing. So, but when you put that before God, when you don't recognize that the Creator has provided those things, then you can get into an idolatrous type of situation. I think that had developed there as well. Abundance of idleness was in her and her daughters, it says there. Proverbs 19:15 and Ecclesiastes 10:18 basically suggest that the word that's used there for idleness is the word sluggishness, the word lazy. There's not a lot of motivation to be industrious and to be moral and to be, of anything of the sort, because you got a lot of this free time. You got a lot of leisure time on your hands. And what is the sentiment in the Bible?
Sounds a lot like today.
Well, it gets even worse. It does sound a lot like today, doesn't it? But you have to have purpose. And if your purpose is just to kind of go through life grabbing all the gusto you can grab, not worried about any accountability or concerns about anybody else's property or etc., then you can run into some real problems. The other thing there, did not strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. That was actually a form of slavery. In other words, you've heard the saying before, you can give a man a fish to eat and he has food for a day, or you can teach a man to fish and he has food for a lifetime.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So there was this, what seemed to exist there. You always have upper classes and lower classes of people that exist in any culture, in any location. It seems like they were providing for a lower class to kind of keep them in check, to kind of enslave them. It was a corrupt welfare system. They didn't strengthen the hand of the poor and the needy. They used their resource there to control the population and to basically have a corrupt welfare type system. Now, when you consider these things, these are the reasons that the Bible provides for the reason that God destroyed these particular cities. When you go into 2 Peter, Peter picks up on this in the New Testament. 2 Peter 2:6, it says, "And turning the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah into ashes, condemn them with an overthrow, making them an example unto those that after should live ungodly." And I think people probably have read these scriptures before. But that's an important verse because it tells us that if God's going to set something up as an example, or almost like a memorial, if you will, if he's going to set something up as an example, as the Bible says, of those that should live ungodly, then here you are. We're showing it right to you, right? Showing it right to you. So that becomes an important consideration. God obviously is in the saving business. He's not in the destroying business. And these people had ripened themselves up for these very four reasons that I just mentioned. And, you'd be hard pressed to find a culture today that is anywhere close to this, right?
You mean as far as the abomination and the evilness?
That's rhetorical, right? Let me just say it this way. We are, and we have followed this same script. We as a Western society, we are ripening ourselves for the very same result. Yes. We are ripening ourselves for destruction because we are proud. And I mean, there's a good type of proud, but there's also an arrogant type of proud, But there's a pride that where ego gets involved, and people end up believing that they're more superior than others. There's an arrogancy, that kind of thing. And of course, we are a very materialistic society. We strive to produce the leisure time. Leisure time is important. Free time is important. We need time to reset. But what do you do with that time? Does that become productive in some way, or does that become destructive in a lot of ways? And I think a lot of our leisure time becomes destructive in a lot of ways. And then we have a corrupt welfare system as well. And the fraud is just so prevalent, it's unbelievable. But, not to say that there aren't people that need help and assistance, but really this is where the churches, I think, have kind of fallen short and out of favor. In that originally the churches would step in and help people that needed help. And then eventually, slowly but surely, history bears out that it was turned over to the governments. But they used it to enslave people, just the same thing that was happening back here. Now, God said he destroyed these cities, and they were to be set as an example of those that should live ungodly. And with all of this archaeology, Brandon, these things that tell a story, sometimes it challenges even the Christian perspective. All right. For example, there are a lot of Christians that go in search of Noah's Ark, and where do they go? They go digging around on top of Mount Ararat. When that's not a biblical site, the Bible doesn't verify that. It just says it landed in the region of Urartu, in the mountain area there. And so they assume that the Bible says that it landed on Mount Ararat or Al Ghridah, in that is what it's called in that area. But it's not biblical. It's not even good science. There are a lot of these sites that we deal with that tell a clearer, definitive story, biblical story. And such is the case also with this particular site of Sodom and Gomorrah. Right? When you look in just before the book of Revelation, you've got the book of Jude. And in Jude, verse 7, it talks about eternal fire. It says, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh. Right? So that's kind of a summary of all of those things. These are all the symptoms. The symptoms of the corruption are a result of the pride, the materialism, the idle time, and the corrupt welfare system. They're the reasons. But the symptoms are a lot of the immorality and nonsense that was going on there. They're the symptoms of all those reasons. But here's Sodom and Gomorrah giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, which is kind of a homosexuality type of thing, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. Yeah, in fact, the Bible says in Revelation that brimstone will be used to create the lake of fire at the end. Right? When the wicked come up and surround the city, New Jerusalem, and fire comes down from God out of heaven and devours them. Okay? It's the same kind of brimstone. And we know that this stuff is incredibly poisonous and extremely hot. When Ron took this to Tennessee to have it tested, they couldn't even test it. They couldn't give him a BTU test in their stainless steel testing chambers because sulfur burns. This is pressed powdered sulfur. It burns hotter than their machines can handle. So they couldn't give him a BTU test. We estimate, and Ron estimated, that cumulative heat in those cities was 4,000 to 5,000 degrees, which creates a process called thermal ionization, which is where you see a lot of the layering. If you go to those areas, you'll see layering that looks like sedimentary layering, but it's not sediment, it's ash. And it's because of the high heat where the molecules repel and contract, and they form into layers.
Wasn't it kind of like a molten lava?
Not quite, but some of the layers are really crazy looking. So let's see, we've looked at the Ark of the Covenant, we've looked at Noah's Ark, Cave of Pelah, Sodom and Gomorrah. I don't know if you want to do anything on the Red Sea crossing site or the real Mount Sinai. Yet Scott on doing the real Mount Sinai, I believe. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if you want to do anything else with the Red Sea crossing site. Those two are kind of connected, but there's also other insights that could possibly be looked at there. Also, the grain bins at Saqqara and the Great Pyramid. Talk about that sometime if you like. Okay. So, yeah, well, Saqqara is about an hour below Cairo, and we know that for those of you that are not aware, Imhotep was the Egyptian name for Joseph. And when Joseph was enslaved initially in Egypt, his brothers took him down there. Or actually, he went down there looking for him, and he became he was sold to a caravan that went to Egypt, sold as a slave. Potiphar's house and so forth. And you can just read the story in Genesis, from Genesis 39 to 50, about 20% of the book, or more, or even more, about 20% of the book focuses on that one story of Joseph going down to Egypt and whatnot. So quite comprehensive. But he was a type of Christ in the Old Testament. There are, I'd say, somebody's calculated over 100 different parallels of what happened to Messiah, and of course what happened with him as well. At any rate, Joseph had interpreted one of the dreams of the king, of the Pharaoh, and it was going to be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And basically Pharaoh said, well, where do I find such a person that can coordinate all this and prepare for all this? And of course that's how Joseph ended up from slavery to the second in command in Egypt. And he developed a series of grain bins and grain storage facilities throughout the country. One of those is down there at Saqqara. And the people, and this is actually how Jacob and the rest of the family, this is how the other 70 souls ended up down in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, because they went down there to buy grain. And of course, this is all in the story of Genesis there that you read. But these are the grain bins, some of the grain bins that Joseph had built. And the interesting thing about the complex there, they call every hole in the ground down there a tomb. Mm-hmm. So when you go into the Saqqara complex there, it's a tomb because they know the tourists, that draws tourism and whatnot.
Aren't those grain silos still there in some form?
Yes.
Yeah, I thought they were. There.
Yeah. God used Joseph to make all the preparation for those 7 years of plenty, and then they had the 7 years of famine, and that's how Jacob and the boys and the whole crew ended up coming down to Egypt and then eventually living down there. But at any rate, you have, this was an example of perseverance. God allowed the whole nation, the 70 souls that came down, they grew and developed and became a mighty people. And then, of course, once Joseph was gone, the story how they ended up becoming enslaved, and they were enslaved for a couple of hundred years. Some people estimate 210. Other people say 430, but I think 430 was from the time that Abram left Hebron to journey toward the Promised Land. So I think it's probably a couple hundred years at least that they were enslaved. And of course that would do a lot to your psyche over that amount of time. And then of course you have Moses leading them out through the Exodus. On the same day, apparently, on Nisan 14, that Abram left. Abram left Haran, Nisan 14. They're 430 years they're coming out of Egypt, Nisan 14. And then when you know it, Jesus is crucified on Nisan 14. So when you talk about patterns
again,
when you talk about pattern, oh man, the numbers are just crazy.
And then another one I noticed was, I know a lot of people debate this, but I believe that Jesus started his ministry. He did it for 3.5 years. And I believe that the tribulation or the rapture is going to happen halfway through the tribulation. So 3.5 years in. Whether people believe that or not, or you believe it, that's what I believe. And that's fine if people disagree. But I just noticed how everything, 3.5 years he did his ministry, 3.5 years into the tribulation. It's just all these different random numbers seem to happen over and over again. 40 days, 40 nights in the desert, 40 years for Moses and the people to be in the desert. Of course, Jesus was in the desert for 40 days. That's why I said that. So it's just so many similarities.
Yeah, actually, there are 110 references to the number 40 in the Bible, and that's quite a few. David's reign, Solomon's reign, 40 years. I mean, you can just go on and on and on. In fact, the podcast that we're going to probably start, I'm not sure exactly when that's going to transpire, but I think our podcast is going to be called The Wonderful Numberer.
Hmm.
And it really is, it goes through exactly what you're talking about. It goes through all of the insight and understanding of the patterns of these numbers that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example, okay? Because we already talked about the Ark of the Covenant and Noah's Ark and so forth. We have the dimensions of Noah's Ark listed there in Genesis. You have the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant listed there in Leviticus and Numbers and so forth. If you end up dividing the 300 cubits of length of Noah's Ark with the 2.5 cubits of the length of the Ark of the Covenant, you come to the number 120. Now, 120 is significant because that was in Genesis 6:3, that was the amount of literal probationary time that God gave to Noah, 120 years. Okay. It would also become symbolic of the total amount of probationary time for the planet. You take 120 Jubilee cycles, right, and you have 6,000 years. And of course, the Ark of the Covenant deals with the whole atonement aspect in plan of salvation,
Right. Yeah.
which deals with that in totality, that's 6,000 years of probation for the planet. Okay, and so you start to see these things that correspond. You take, for example, I'll give you one more. Jeremiah was instructed as he was going through his prophetic career. He was instructed that when you see, I think God gave him a sign, that when you see this sign of the Babylonian army surrounding the city, you hide the sanctuary furniture. And I think he had passed that on to his priests and whatnot. And so we know that Nebuzaradan, the general Nebuzaradan from the Babylonian army, he came up and surrounded the city of Jerusalem in 587-ish BC, right? And of course, when he besieged the city, in other words, he surrounds the city, I believe that was the signal. Now that's actually happening on the 10th month of the 10th day of Tevet on the Hebrew calendar, right? So you got the 10th month, which is Tevet. The 10th day of the 10th month is when that occurs. I believe it's the next day, on the 11th, that the priests are actually securing the Ark of the Covenant into the chamber where it was found by Ron Wyatt. What's interesting is that when he went in there, right, he actually stood outside the entrance of the chamber on January the 5th, and then on January the 6th, he went into the chamber. Well, it just so happens that January 5th, 1982, is the 10th month of the 10th day of Tevet. And when he went into the chamber is the 11th day of the 10th month of Tevet. So it is quite possible that the very same day that the ark was secreted away was the very same day that God allowed him into the chamber.
Yeah, it would make sense.
Yeah. So see, that's the kind of thing that people don't, unless you kind of get into digging and that kind of thing, you don't recognize that kind of thing. So We've just come out, we've just finished up a publication called January 6th. And that's going to be...
That has modern day parallels too, with January 6th being in the news. That's insane.
Yeah. So anyway, we are going to have that available. It's being edited right now, and that's going to be available in digital form. And the other thing that's happening with us is that we're going to put out a whole series of audiobooks And the Ark Secret is the first one that's going to be ready for release. I think by the end of this week, the Ark Secret is going to be out in video.
And people can get that on your website, right?
Audio book. Yeah, that'll be up on the website.
Okay. I'll have a QR code up on the screen for people to go to that.
At any rate, that's what's kind of going on with us and what's keeping us busy right now. Well, Ron demonstrated in 1994. Ron demonstrated a pyramid building machine there, right on the Great Pyramid.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember seeing video clips of that.
Yeah, so he was always interested in that kind of thing. Even before I think he got into with Noah's Ark, and I think he was interested in those kind of historical aspects.
We can definitely dive into that because that's actually a point of interest for me because I don't believe the pyramids were built to be a tomb. I think that there was an alternate.
There's no evidence of that.
Right. Yeah, there was an alternate use for those pyramids, and it had nothing to do with burying the dead and had everything to do with creating, if you want to call it, Wi-Fi electricity. That's my personal belief. So, yeah.
Yeah, great point.
Because you can look inside of it. It's charred, all of it inside. And you need a few things to generate electricity. And what they found inside of the pyramids is exactly the components.
The Queen's chamber is coated in sodium.
Right. And that's one of the ingredients. Exactly right.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we can definitely.
Have you been in there yourself? Have you been running around inside there?
No, I have not. I have never been to the pyramids.
Yeah, it's the most number one tourist site in the world. Well, let's put it this way: it's in the top 3.
All right. Well, Jerry, thank you very much. Yeah.
Yeah, my pleasure, and we'll do it again next time.
Yep. All right.
God bless and have a wonderful day.
Yep. Take it easy.
Don't work too hard.
Thank you.